Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second Seeds of Knowledge webinar. We begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I'm Al, and I'm the Partnerships Coordinator here at Seeding Victoria, and I'd like to thank the funders of our Seeds of Knowledge program, the Bullock and Northern Grampians Landcare Network, to welcome Associate Professor John Morgan from La Trobe University. He is the head of Department, Environment and Genetics, and is a wonderful, amazing plant ecologist. Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us tonight, John.
Thanks, Al, and let's get into it. So my title is Seeds are Fundamental to Regeneration, and we're going to focus on grassy ecosystems, but we don't always see seedlings, and we should be asking the question, why is that? So I'm going to be focusing mostly on southeastern Australia in the red zone there that you can see in this map, which is the grassy ecosystems, the temperate grasslands, the threatened temperate grasslands of southeastern Australia. In yellow are the more northern, more arid and also subtropical grasslands, Mitchell grass grasslands. You can see they're really, really extensive. We know very little about those ecosystems, but in southeastern Australia, we know quite a lot because there's been a long tradition and history of biologists studying the grassland flora and fauna because it's highly endangered. Much of it's been lost, and we're looking at ways to preserve species in this landscape and restore this landscape. I've been in the game a little bit longer than I want to let you know, but I started in 1992. So that sounds to me about 30 odd years. And I've been thinking for a long time about the ecology of grassy ecosystems, how they sustain themselves, and the importance of seed regeneration for recovering systems and expanding those systems. And I spent my formative years focusing on this little plant here called the button wrinklewort. The button wrinklewort is a plant I'll return to over several times during the talk because it ties some of the threads together really nicely. So let's start at the start. And I think it's really, really important. Seeds are critical, clearly, to create seedlings, which then hopefully move through into a phase where we get juveniles, or at least juveniles and larger plants. And eventually they turn into mature flowering plants that start the cycle again by producing fruits, which generate the seeds to start the cycle. Now, this totally sort of overplays the significance in some respects of this cycle for all species, because some species will be very dependent on production of seed and seedlings on a frequent basis to maintain populations. For other species, it's the persistence of those mature plants over decades, centuries, even millennia in some cases, that is a really critical feature of that population, with very rare recruitment to replace or supplement the dead plants as they happen through time. So I wanted to start with thinking that these cycles, whilst they're quite descriptive and easy to understand, for different species, it'll be really different where the important limiting factor is to the persistence and regeneration of a species. And this is really relevant to our grassy ecosystems, where by and large, there are not many annual plants. There are annual plants, and as it turns out, many of them have disappeared from our landscapes, and that's a story for a different day. But many of our plants are perennial in our grassy ecosystems, and I'm focusing on the understory here. Some are even clonal, meaning they potentially live for forever if they could. Their lifespan varies from short, a couple of years, and so in a grassy ecosystem, a plant that lives for 3 to 5 years would definitely be considered short-lived. And some are very, very long, and we'd be talking about centuries. They have variable year-to-year flowering, which is driven in part because of climatic variation. And just before we started tonight, I was talking to Al about this year's flowering. It seems like it could be a poor flowering year. But that can also be linked to other factors such as the prevalence of fire. Some species are known to flower much more prolifically after a fire and then disappear from the flowering phase in between fire events. So their year-to-year flowering is triggered by disturbance events. And as a consequence, plants more broadly tend to be either persisters, they hang around as individuals for quite a long time, pumping out seeds in the hope that some of those will turn into seedlings, whereas others will be not very long-lived, and their aim is to colonise new habitats or habitats that are frequently made available because they disperse well and they regenerate well. So maybe as a starting point, we might begin to think that, or I'd like to get you to think that grassy plants tend to be more towards the persister side of things. They tend to have variable flowering, and some of them in particular are quite long-lived. That might influence how we think about the prevalence of seedling regeneration. Now, going back to 1935, a guy called R.T. Patton, one of the first people to describe the structure of a grassland, drew this little fantastic thing using a little machine called a pantograph, which is really just tracing plants on the ground, and there's a little arm that then traces it onto a piece of paper. And what we see in grasslands is the black images there, they're dominant grasses, they'll be kangaroo grass in this instance, and there's lots of species that exist around the kangaroo grass. So most of the diversity exists in the spaces between. So the question becomes, how do you get into those spaces and how do you persist? How important is seedling regeneration? The outcome of that thinking really then determines how we think about how these ecosystems work. Are these quite static, that these plants that we can see here in both images really are there for a long time? Once they get in, they're there for a long time with occasional recruitment. In natural ecosystems, I want to stress as well. Or are they shifting about because seeds play a really crucial role in the dynamics of these ecosystems? And I want to explore that idea a little bit and think about why we'd get either, really. Now, if we go back and think really basically about seed regeneration in any ecosystem, a plant produces some seeds and there's some things might happen. Those seeds make their way into the soil and they could germinate. They might germinate more in numbers of species or numbers of individuals in wet seasons. And then we go through a filter, as it were, for how many make it to a seedling, how many make it to a long-term adult entry into the ecosystem. And we'd predict that in drier seasons, we'd see fewer. But that's the key assumption there, is that seedlings play a critical role from year to year. I've been following, with various degrees of sort of integrity, I suspect, seedling regeneration now for, well, since I started in the game, of one particular species, the button wrinklewort. And the button wrinklewort in this particular example is at Truganina Cemetery on the outskirts of Melbourne. It's a cemetery that was created in the 1850s or thereabouts, fenced off from grazing, and supports a fabulous little remnant of this ecosystem, this grassland ecosystem. These numbers are real. I've got permanent plots where I go out and I look for seedling recruitment in a button wrinklewort population. And when the very first year I did this, I saw hundreds of seedlings. And I wrote a paper that said, oh, seedling regeneration in the button wrinklewort's not a big deal. Happens really easily. So if we scale what I saw in my very first year, 1993, we just call that 1 or 100. Like that's the maximum number I saw in that year. Every year since, I've seen fewer seedlings. In many cases, I've seen no seedlings. So go out and I put my quadrants out, and this is a good year, 2024. There is no seedling regeneration this year. And so the question starts becoming, is this normal? Is this how grassy ecosystems work? There's occasional pulses of seedlings. They then allow the population to persist through time, and that's interspersed with periods where there are no seedlings whatsoever. And if that's true, we then need to start teasing out, well, why do we see no seedlings in some years? And why do we see lots of seedlings in others? But I hope you get from this data here, and this is probably the best data you're ever going to see. And it's, I guess the longer I do it, it makes me say, I have to keep doing this now, don't I? I have to see, can we get another pulse? But over, half my lifetime, just about, half of the events, there's been no recruitment of this population. And that's not a big deal because this plant lives but for potentially 15 years at this site. So it doesn't need to regenerate every year. So that gets us to focus about how often do we need this to happen? It should happen every year. Button wrinkleworts produce really viable seed. It's so easy to germinate. You just chuck it on top of some soil, some potting mix, you water it, they germinate. They grow super easily. This is an easy plant to grow. So it's not because there's a trick to getting these things to regenerate, at least from a seedling perspective. And if we extend that idea, that's one species, can we think about this in relation to other species and ask the question, well, how often might seeds actually produce seedlings? So here we've got the phase of germination, little recruitments, turning more into established plants. Well, an easy way to test this idea experimentally, I'm a scientist, is to sow a bunch of seeds of known quantity and follow what happens. Now, this is a small sample size, I grant you, but for 8 species, just in this particular example, we sowed a bunch of seeds. So in the first year, or not in the first year, year 0, as it were, we sowed a bunch of seeds. So I'm just going to call that there's 100%, or there's 1. That's everything. At the end of the first year, there was only basically 2 species that germinated in any sort of substantial numbers from all those seeds we sowed. A couple of species didn't germinate at all, and a couple germinated at infinitesimally low levels. Now that's okay, because maybe those species were never going to germinate in that first year. They might turn up at some future point. But a key assumption there is that seeds are lying dormant, waiting to germinate. By year 2, there were no plants left of any of the species that had germinated in the first year. There were none left. Of the ones that didn't germinate in the first year, none of them germinated, and we followed this for 3 years. I'm often known as the guy who studies nothing. By year 3, we saw nothing. And this is really, it's quite depressing at one level if you're trying to restore ecosystems or recover ecosystems and you're seeing this kind of output in a natural system again. But maybe this is normal because they're not designed to regenerate every single year. They need some trigger or cue. So I often get asked, well, maybe it's because those seeds face a lot of hazards, and those hazards are the reason we see no regeneration. And that would be true. One of the ones that's underappreciated, and I have only just come recently to appreciate it, is a hazard called florivory. That's when an insect, so we've got a caterpillar up the top, an unknown or an unnamed caterpillar, we've got a scarab beetle down below. When an insect comes along and it eats the flowers before they even start forming seeds. We often think about seed predation after the seeds are formed. These guys do it. Here's rudidosis again, the button wrinklewort. And you can see this is having a pretty profound impact on individual heads. So the caterpillar on the top left, that's on the top right, that's what happened after it had been grazing that flower head. It probably reduced seed production potential by 30%. And the scarab beetle, it's probably reduced seed production by almost 100% there because it's eating the flowers. They don't have anthers, they don't have styles, they can't pollinate. So they're not actually eating the ovaries, they're eating the flowers, and hence it can't form a seed. So we don't know how widespread this is, but for some species, this is quite a big deal. And I'm seeing it increasingly in some plant populations. So that's one reason why we might not get regeneration. Another is because if seedlings do emerge, they get hoovered up really quickly by slugs. A little known fact in the grassy ecosystems of southeastern Australia, not forest ecosystems, grassy ecosystems of plains country, there are no native slugs. So that means none of our native herbaceous plants have any defences against these types of herbivores. They've never seen them before. So they don't know how, there's been no reason to defend seedlings against slugs or mollusks. These guys are super common now in grasslands because they've spilled over from adjoining agricultural lands where the farmers also hate these things because they're eating their seedlings, they're munching away at their growing crops and all that kind of stuff, but they've spilled into grassy ecosystems. They have predators, not natural predators because these have come from overseas, but carabid beetles, native carabid beetles in our grassy ecosystems will eat these things. But unfortunately, the carabid beetles are at such low densities and there's so many slugs, they can't make a dent in the population. So we tend to find that these can hoover up seedlings, and I've seen rudidosis seedlings getting eaten by slugs. So there's a second reason why we might not see much seed regeneration or seedling regeneration. Third reason, perhaps our grassy ecosystems, which are designed to be burnt and they're also designed to be grazed, if we don't have those disturbances, we end up with a dense grassland. And these little seedlings of native plants we know from lots of experimental work don't really like growing in the shade. They're not rainforest plants. They're high light plants. They like growing in the open. So as our disturbance regimes have gone down, we're burning these ecosystems potentially less, or they're not getting grazed in the way they used to historically, we get dense grass. And that's the end point for many seedlings. They just cannot persist in the dense grass. So it could be the lack of disturbance that is causing regeneration failure in some of the populations I'm seeing, and that's absolutely true. And possibly one that we've increasingly become aware of in the last, say, 5 to 10 years is the loss of digging animals. You're all probably aware of bandicoot diggings, creating, as you can see there on the left, these soil disturbances that become ideal places for both bringing seeds up to the surface for germination, or alternatively fantastic microsites for dispersing seeds to land onto. And we can see a bunch of species that prefer to grow in bare soil like that relative to intact grassland swards or even undisturbed soil. One of the ones we haven't really understood very well, but we should give some attention to, is the burrowing bettong up in the top right there. The reason being, burrowing bettongs are the only macropod that lives in burrows, hence the name burrowing, I guess. And there's been some dating of these burrows that says once they were occupied by a family group, that became a lineage, and the same burrows might have been occupied for centuries by the offspring, the daughters and the sons and the daughters and the granddaughters and what have you of these burrowing bettongs. And why that's just important is if they were persistent in the landscape, these animals then come out at night time, they forage, they graze, they dig, they do all their stuff. But this would have been happening on a really consistent basis within however many hundreds of meters of each of these burrows. So for a plant, that would have been a place that predictably was getting disturbed. And you would have known, if you were into that sort of thing, if you like disturbance, you would have had a microsite predictably created over thousands upon thousands of years that just disappeared as soon as European colonisation came along and we lost a lot of our ground fauna. I think that's a really underappreciated one, and it may be one we should think about in future in terms of what's its relative importance in improving regeneration. So there's some reasons why we wouldn't see regeneration. So this gets us to the really interesting question. Grassland regeneration projects like the Grassy Ecosystems project here, run by Paul Gibson-Roy and others, John Delprat, who I saw was in the audience, have been wildly successful in some contexts. We're getting heaps of species regenerating, heaps of germination. But this is where the ground has been scalped off, well, the topsoil has been scalped off of perhaps nutrient-rich soil and weed invasion, and you're creating a bare substrate. And maybe what we're doing is creating this great bare substrate, there's great soil-seed contact, there's great opportunities for germination to happen and to sort of come through in time. I'm happy for John to talk more about that story, but I think it's an interesting kind of thing that in nature, we don't see necessarily very many seedlings, but if we try to restore some of these ecosystems, some of the species at least are really well attuned to replacing or regenerating in these places. Maybe they were the same sort of species that were germinating on top of burrowing bettong colonies. I don't know. It's worth us thinking about. So I'm going to propose a pretty controversial hypothesis based on evidence, but the evidence might be because of the lack of digging animals and because of slugs and because of other things, that the short-term currency of seeds in the maintenance of, there's some big words here, spatially heterogeneous grassy ecosystems, variable, just, patterns of nature. Maybe the short-term currency is quite low, meaning we wouldn't expect to see seedlings every single year. And I'll get onto that in a little while as to why that might be. Now, that's a hypothesis. You can disagree with me, you can agree with me, but lots of evidence would suggest that we throw seeds out and we don't see very many of them germinate and turn into plants. Yeah, we have very diverse grasslands in some instances. So why might that be? Okay, well, here's a hypothesis that, again, is just an idea. But in grassy ecosystems, many of the plants have small and numerous seeds. The wildflower displays can be spectacular. We see all these flowers, which hopefully then turn into seeds, and they disperse either very short distances or maybe longer distances, and then they don't seem to amount to much. And in nature, that's actually really common, that when you have small, numerous seeds, each plant is not investing much into their offspring. So they're just chucking their seeds out saying, good luck, let's see how you go. So for many of our species, maybe that's their biology. They just chuck them out and there's occasional successful recruitment, but a lot of the time it's not. That's just their biology. And if we contrast that to heathlands that grow on nutrient-poor soils where they take a long time to grow, you know, they're slow and steady sort of growth. They're not really like grassland plants at all. One of the characteristics of many heathland species, particularly in the protea family, so Banksias and Hakeas, is they don't produce very many seeds and they're much bigger than what you would expect out of grassland plants. Why is that? Because they're actually investing in their future. They're saying it's really hard to make a seed. I'm going to invest in that because I want that seed to have a really good shot at producing a new plant at some point in the future. And it might only get one shot straight after fire when they release all their seeds. So this is maybe why grassy ecosystems don't have so much seedling regeneration that's successful, because the seeds are not designed to do that. Doesn't mean they can't do it. But heathlands, they can only do it after fire in many instances. And so they put all their effort, as it were, into ensuring that one event is the one time they will be successful. It's a really interesting difference in biology. And we can take that idea a little bit further. So as a biologist, we talk about life history. It's like, how does a plant or an animal make a living? Is it the tortoise and the hare? So here's just a hypothesis based on a lot of data again. On the y-axis, I've just tried to illustrate how much seed production is happening relative to the amount of growth, if you like. So basically in this instance, on the left-hand side, we're saying lots of seeds relative to the amount of growth. And as plants live longer, what's that proportion? Well, usually as plants live longer, they're investing more into their growth and not so much into seed production. So we expect to see fewer seeds being produced relative to the amount of growth. And that might explain why, that's a really tiny photo there, and that's an annual plant. It's mostly all seeds, not much growth, because it has to produce in less than 1 year, well and truly less than 1 year, probably 12 weeks. It has to produce lots of seeds to ensure the future of that population, that species, because it's going to die. And then we get some daisies that live relatively short amount of time, 5 to 10 years maybe, and so they are pretty showy. They produce lots of flowers, they produce lots of seeds, don't live very long. And then we have long-lived species like kangaroo grass, which could live easily for decades, possibly even a century, possibly even longer. That relatively, in a relative sense, produces very few seeds per individual in any 1 year, relative to an annual plant. But if you think about it, grassland plants, I've sort of already been hinting, they can live pretty long periods of time, decades. So in this graph, it's another hypothesis supported a bit by evidence. The y-axis in this instance is how many seeds do you produce in your lifetime? So if you live for 100 years, you might actually produce an awful lot of seed. And if the aim is for that species to reproduce once successfully, to replace itself, then if at that time scale, there's lots of opportunities for seeds to regenerate. Might be even just once a decade. Well, that could be 10 times they regenerate. That's actually super, super successful in the scheme of thinking about nature. And the short-lived plants, whilst they produce lots of seed in a one-off event, in a relative sense, that might be relatively few seeds. And so they have to ensure they're going to be successful. So these are just some ideas about getting you to think about how plants might make a living. And I think these are two trade-offs: how long you live and what's your lifetime reproductive fitness. So if you're going to produce all these seeds, either as a short-lived plant or as a long-lived plant, the most critical thing to understand is, can you survive in the soil and what might trigger you to then germinate? No point producing all these seeds to sit in the soil, never to germinate. That makes no sense whatsoever. So in this graph, I'm just generalizing here. Now, this is not so much born of data, and I'm happy to be corrected on my assumptions here. But on the y-axis, I'm talking about can the species or the group of plants here form seed banks, probably long-lived seed banks. And here we go. I'm going to go by different types of plants, because this gets us thinking about which species should we expect to see germinating and which ones might not germinate that often because they're waiting for a cue. Okay, a lot of daisies don't live very long in soil seed banks. My rudidosis example, they live less than a year in the soil, very short-lived. Others live 2-3 years. So their thing is to continue to pump seed out in the hope that they might find some successful sites to germinate in. They're not relying on seed banks. There's big generalizations we're making here. What about sedges? Well, lots of work tells us that sedges, which produce tiny little seeds, and they're pretty insignificant little plants, have some of the biggest seed banks. So they pump their seeds out and they sit there waiting for an opportunity, and then they might germinate. So that's their kind of biology. What about grasses? I didn't really know where to put them, so I'm happy to be corrected here. Some grasses can make quite big seed banks and others not very many, so maybe it's from short to long. What about lilies? My gut feeling, and from what I see, is that lilies actually do produce seed banks that sit there waiting for something. That could be a fire, and it's not necessarily the heat of the fire, it's the products of fire. It's smoke or the chemicals that are the constituents of smoke. And we see lilies sometimes that have been absent from a site for decades can pop up after a fire because of that stimulus. So we're starting to get the feel now that some species we would expect to see seedlings, others would be rare because that's their design. For peas, most of us would probably guess that peas are long-lived. And so I've just chucked them there in a relative sense, they're probably fairly long-lived. That may not apply to all peas, but certainly clover, unfortunately, one of the things you pick up in soil seed banks all the time, the exotic clover, it clearly makes a seed bank, unfortunately. And then annuals, surprisingly, yes, they create seed banks, but they're not as long-lived as you might think, depending on what your timescale is here. Some work we've done in the past says that for many annual species, they might not live more than 2 to 3 decades in the soil, which seems like a long time, but in the scheme of things, it's not. So annuals actually need to keep replacing the seed bank. Otherwise, it just sort of dwindles down, and then we would expect to see no annuals. So where I'm going with this is to get you thinking about why would we see seedlings? Why wouldn't we? These are the kind of reasons. So to summarize those concepts just then, why would species differ? Well, some are wanting to exploit predictable niches for germination. So that could be the animal digging type species, or alternatively, if there was frequent fire, that might be the stimulus. But for others, they're waiting for some rare coincidence of events, as it were. Maybe it's a flood. They won't regenerate otherwise. Or maybe it's a drought that triggers them that says, okay, we know we're going through a dry phase. We better be ready for when the drought-breaking rain comes. For others, it could be fire. And so this starts to get us to think more about nuance when we want to restore ecosystems. It's not just a matter of throwing seeds out and hoping they germinate, because the biology of these species tells us they're looking for different things to cue them to do that. This is quite well appreciated for some species, but broadly, we're not sure how many it might apply to. Maybe, just maybe, we've got this all wrong. Many of the grassy plants I've been talking about tend to survive from year to year by dying back over summer, like in the drought phase, and they resprout from the base. And what are they resprouting from? Well, typically underground storage organs, some place where they can resprout from. And many grassland plants, that is their primary biology. They're not there all year, they're there some times of the year. Just like orchids, just like lilies. They pop up and then they disappear, but the plant survives below ground. So just maybe, for many of these species, seeds and seedlings are just not their thing from year to year. And so I want to explore that idea and the implications of that from here. Okay, the how and why, I forgot to put in the why, so I'll tell you the why, it's here. How do we know this stuff? Well, I'm an idiot. I've set up lots of permanent transects across Western Victoria in particular, but also on the northern plains of Northern Victoria. And I go out and I monitor not just the presence or absence of species, but I monitor the number of individuals of different species in populations in different communities over long time periods. And if you do that, you start figuring out the rhythms of different species. Here's one rhythm. In this particular example, I went out in some permanent quadrats at different times of the year, and I counted, and these are quadrats that are only 50 centimetres by 50 centimetres. There was lots of them, but I'm just showing you an average here. I counted the number of individual plants in each 50 by 50 centimetre quadrat. And we see this predictable rhythm. We see in spring, the numbers are sort of winter, spring, numbers are quite high. And across 2 seasons, and if we'd started that first sampling a little bit earlier, it probably would have been 3 seasons, we see almost the exact same number of individual plants across 2 different years. They then, the individuals die over summer. Some survive. So we can see there are a few perennial plants that are surviving through summer. That's probably the kangaroo grass and the dominant grasses. And then they resprout come autumn, and they get back to their peak numbers, as it were, and then they die. Not dying as individuals, dying just off above ground. What this tells us is there's a really predictable resprouting rhythm in grasslands. This is what many species are attuned to. And so things that disrupt that rhythm are actually the big threat. If I was to pull out the number of seedlings I saw in these quadrats, I could do that, I haven't got that here today. It was really low just across these 2 years, yet there were close to 600 plants in a quarter square metre quadrat. Maybe seeds and seedlings aren't their thing on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis. The why of change really is, well, each year is different. We've got climatic variation, we've got droughts, we've got floods. We've got disturbances. Some years the ecosystem might burn. In more recent times, we've had ecosystems being disturbed by sheep or whatever the agricultural animal might have been. And that will impact those numbers. So the question becomes, by how much? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, because it might depend on when those fires happen. This is a slide I put up in most of my talks, because I just think it's really interesting. In autumn, when most of those plants were dormant and they got burnt, they didn't see a fire. So technically, in many respects, they're not even being exposed to that fire. And then comes spring, just a few months later, look at that beautiful flowering floriferous grassland, producing lots and lots of seeds, lots and lots of potential regeneration in the following year. And yet we don't see it much. So the timing of the cue might be really important for cueing germination, as opposed to allowing plants just to regenerate via vegetative sprouts. Hopefully you get where I'm going with that. And for some species, this is kangaroo grass, even though they look like they've been obliterated by fire, they're so tenacious that they start resprouting days after being burnt, particularly in summer. And they resprout and they grow vigorously, and they'll pop up their flowering stems next year and they'll drop their seeds. But very few of those will turn into seedlings. I've been following kangaroo grass tussocks now for close to 30 years. And many of the tussocks I tagged 30 years ago are still alive, and many of them haven't grown very much more than the size when I first measured them 30 years ago. It says to me these ecosystems are like old growth forests. They're there ticking over. They don't need to regenerate very often, as long as the individuals in that population continue to tick over. And then occasionally we would expect to see new babies born into the population. But that might happen infrequently. We simply haven't looked at these systems long enough to know that. Getting back to this slide. So we're focused initially thinking about seeds and how that might change from different years according to how wet or dry it is. What I'm wanting you to push into is to think about sprouts and how often do they survive, or how often can they keep coming back? Because if you think about it, this is the origin of most plants in grassy ecosystems, is what's already there, its ability to resprout, so at some future point it can regenerate, hopefully, some new offspring. So I want to spend just a few minutes thinking about sprouts. This is that looks like a hypericum to me, Hypericum gramineum, one of the native St. John's wort. And you can see it's, vigorously resprouting come autumn rains. Sprouts are all about persisting, just like a tree would persist, from year to year. This is the equivalent, I think. We have some frameworks as biologists to think about sprouts. And so there's basically a very simple way to think about this is, where are the buds located from which a plant resprouts every year? That gives us a bit of a feel for what they're doing. And we have two types, primarily. We have this big word called hemicryptophyte. Really, all that means is the resprouting buds are near the surface or at the surface of the soil. And they can be clonal plants as well. That makes them really vulnerable to whatever happens right at the very surface. If you're coming along and you've got sheep grazing, compacting that, maybe that's going to be a really negative outcome for those types of species. Or if you come along and you just happen to strip off with your mower the topsoil, you might be cutting off their ability to resprout. Cryptophytes, great name, crypto, hidden, where the buds rest below ground, sometimes at quite some distance. And so one of the first things we do as biologists is we try and classify species into these different types. But where do they resprout from? Because that tells us a bit about how do they survive their hazards from year to year. So here's two types of resprouting plants. On the left is a plantago. It's a little bit chewed up and not the best example I know. And on the right, a resprouting grass. What do we know about these things? Well, what we do know is that grassland plants allocate heaps of resources not into their flowers and seeds, but below ground into fleshy roots. They're conserving their resources. So if you think of an orchardist, in a time of plenty, you put some away, put it in the jars for a time when you don't have so much. That's what these plants are doing. So they're actually making a choice to divert energy away from reproduction and put it into persistence. But what that means is that once they get disturbed or coming back each year after drought, they can rapidly resprout. So they don't have to, as it were, grow lots of energy before they can start flowering. They're already rapidly re-establishing and they can put some of that into flowering. So this is how they're made up. There's lots of different examples, and I'll just run through a few. I put this one in often in these talks as well because I think it's just staggering. This is Tylotus macrocephalus, which is the featherheads. Beautiful thing growing above ground, but it has a really long, thickened stem, basically, or thickened root below ground, and that can extend as long as your arm, and in some instances, it's about as thick as your arm. And I just love this image on the left-hand side. So this one was being, until a few years ago, we didn't know what these things did. So digging one up like this we weren't really sure what we were going to see, I guess. But look how few leaves there are on the plant. So, and this massive below ground storage organ, which you can see here, goes all the way down. And this one is, if I can see on the side, it's 60 centimetres to there pretty much, and it snapped off. It wasn't even sort of tapering yet. These things give these plants enormous longevity. They're like trees, they're below ground trees. In fact, some people describe them as that. There's been some estimates of how long an individual like that might live. Well, we don't know how long they live, but we can age that, and it comes out at somewhere like 300 years. So you start reevaluating your thinking about how some of these grassland plants work. They're there for the long term, and occasionally they will regenerate, just like a mountain ash forest would up near my place in Sherbrooke Forest. Very infrequent, but when it does it, it can be successful. Geraniums have these below ground, underground storage organs, big swellings, big carbohydrate stores. Again, relative to the size of the top growth, they invest a lot of energy below ground, and that comes at the expense of growing flowers and seeds. They're putting it into persistence. Thinking about that lifetime reproduction, though, that might be a really good strategy. On the left here, we've got one of the lilies, Caesia caliantha, and look at those tubers. It's fantastic. And on the right, the yam daisy, Microceros walteri, where it's doing its thing, which it does. That's probably this previous year's tuber. That tuber overwintered, then it got to spring. It then put all its energy into growing some top growth. The top growth then starts diverting energy back into the tuber, because it's the tuber that allows the plant to persist from year to year, not seeds per se. It's producing seeds. They can colonize bearish spots, but there's a lot of energy going into ensuring the persistence of the individual. So my second hypothesis, controversial or not, is the long-term currency of most tuberous plants or vegetative parts of plants or underground storage organisms is actually really, really important to the maintenance of diversity in grasslands or grassy ecosystems. Because once they're there for a long time, probably decades, and for some species, centuries. we have to start thinking about them as trees. Why this becomes important, and I'm coming towards the end of my presentation, is what's happened over the last 4 decades is in many grassy ecosystems in southeastern Australia, we've lost diversity from those remnant grasslands and grassy woodlands. And that's really sad. I find that really challenging. In a period where conservation has got interested in grassy ecosystems, they've actually lost a lot of their values. So between 1979 and 2018, this is Truganina Cemetery, where that button wrinklewort I introduced you to earlier was growing. And you can see on the left, it was a diverse ecosystem. On the right, it's not very diverse anymore. It's lost a lot of those species. They're probably not going to come back because many of them don't have seed banks. And we now know potentially that seedling regeneration is not something that happens every year. So we've now got a paddock of grass, as it were, that is at much lower diversity. And when we surveyed a whole bunch of grassy ecosystems over the sort of equivalent time period of 40 years, a few years ago now, we found the only species that were increasing were a bunch of species I'm not particularly interested in. In fact, these are almost native weeds. You might recognise some of these. Epilobium, I wouldn't get too excited by an epilobium in my system. I wouldn't get very excited at all by a Senecio quadridentatus in some respects. I would up to a point. These are all tall, wind-dispersed, weedy plants that have become more common in our grassy ecosystems. They should actually be quite rare, rare in the context of not that common. And they don't invest at all below ground. So they're doing the complete opposite of most grassland plants, and they're the ones that have increased. I don't get excited by any of those. I get excited by, and they're basically cedars, I get excited by the things that are in decline. It so happens most of these species don't just invest very much in long distance dispersal. They don't have wind dispersal by and large. If you dig them up below ground, you would find they've got lots of below ground storage. They're there for the long term. They're persisters. And so we've seen a whole bunch of these species decline over time. This is the sprouters. And so we might kind of conclude that we've lost the resprouting niche, and we've lost that possibly for exactly the same reasons we wouldn't see seedlings. It's too dense now. We don't have enough fire or grazing disturbance. These species can't live indefinitely under a dense canopy, and they drop out. And that has really profound implications, because what we know for many of these species, that if we started just improving the management of some of these sites, they're not likely to recover these species very easily. They're either absent, as I said, from the seed bank, or that rare coincidence of events means that we haven't hit the sweet spot for these species to regenerate. So we would predict limited short-term recovery of some of these species. Hence, it says we need to really value the remnant grasslands, grassy woodlands that we have that are diverse. And we're going to ensure we do everything in our powers through management to ensure they maintain their values, that we don't get to the point where we've sort of lost the values and then we try to recover them. That doesn't seem to be the way to go. One of those things we could do gets us into the realm of gardening, rescue plantings. So returning back to Truganina and my button wrinklewort, just last week, we're out and we planted 222, as it turns out, rudidosis back into this population. Again, the habitat doesn't look great, I know. There is a fire plan for this season or coming up in the next 6 months. Why did we do that? Because we know putting an individual in hopefully overcomes that really difficult step of getting a seedling to emerge. And we think it's the lack of seedlings with poor management that has led to a population decline. So where does this take us? Well, historically, we knew that European settlement came along and many of our grassy ecosystems declined over time. They were grazed, they were abused, they were ploughed up, cropped, what have you. We understand that. We've got to this point in time where we hope through our conservation actions, we can either stabilise that decline, or we'd all like to think we can improve the trajectory of our grassy ecosystems. I think we don't want to be naive to the idea that maybe they are still in decline, despite the fact we might have taken off the threatening processes because of the inability to regenerate easily, perhaps the loss of some of the species, or they're such low numbers now they can't produce many seeds and therefore they blink out. We need to be aware of that. And so Paradoxically, I think we need to reinvent ourselves to get back to this idea of how do you actually get seedlings, seed to germinate? That's actually pretty easy. How do you get seedlings to happen in natural ecosystems in response to restoration activities, but also climate change adaptation, because these things are going to have to adapt to climate, clearly. How do we promote that? And so I'm going to leave you with this idea, and I know less about this, although I'm getting into this than others would know. Where I think we should spend the next few years of our lives is to actually look at improving seed technology to ensure that if we're going to collect seed, we actually optimize the likelihood that that seed will turn into a plant that can start restoring or returning diversity to native ecosystems. There's lots of different technologies. There's things called seed priming. And I just put this quote in here. This idea of you don't just chuck seeds out and hope for the best. We actually know that's probably not going to be, in natural systems, a very good idea. Most of that seed will be wasted. But what if we germinate that seed beforehand and introduce those seeds into microsites that are going to be most successful for those seedlings to survive? That could be in a burnt grassland, for argument's sake, but we've already overcome the germination early seedling establishment phase. Prime seeds display more uniform and faster germination and enhanced stress tolerance, which is really interesting, properties that may increase their establishment. This has been shown in mine site rehabilitation in Western Australia. We may well already be doing some of this here in Victoria, and I'm not aware of it in many instances. I'm sure we are doing some of this. I think this is where we need to go. So my take-home message is, despite everything I've said, the future actually lies in ensuring the seed that is being produced by these ecosystems, species in these ecosystems, can be maximised to result in plants in the ground that reverse the decline that we've all been documenting over the last 40 years. And with that, Elle, I'll stop and thank you everyone for your attention.
Oh, well, thank you for that, John. There's a lot of food for thought there, and even I've been writing down notes and trying to consider how we even prioritise what we do from seed collection and seed propagation areas as well. There's a lot there, and I was going to ask the benefits of me running this is that I can ask my questions first while some other people pop some in the chat. You did mention the idea of like gardening. I was going to ask about how some of those grassland species react to translocation. So if you had a site that was going to be destroyed, what is the likelihood of survival for those long tubers that we see being translocated to another place? Because I know a lot of Australian natives don't tend to do well with that.
I'd be more than happy to hear what other people's experiences are as well, but I'll just start with one of the ways that I've been around a while. I'm starting to date myself. I was involved in some of the early grassland restoration at Organ Pipes National Park, where we were digging up plants that were being developed in Taylor's Lakes and Caroline Springs and places like that, planting them into Organ Pipes National Park. And they had a couple of risks, introduced a whole bunch of weeds, actually, unfortunately, as well, because we were digging these things up with clods of soil. And the overall survival was appallingly bad for the amount of effort that went into it. Now, that's not to say that that is what will always happen, but that Tylotus, that featherheads, pushy tails thing, that goes down so far. And the one I showed in that photo, it snapped off. So I'm guessing that's the end of that plant. So I think it would work really well for chocolate lilies. There's going to be a hierarchy. Chocolate lilies, no problem at all. Dianellas that spread much more vegetatively, really. No problem whatsoever. We could probably make a list, and then there'll be a list of things we'd say, nah, not so good. Geraniums, easy to dig up and translocate. But I think it's a really nice idea, really labour intensive, and the number of plants you'd probably get into the ground would be pretty small, so it's a lot of effort for not much return. So you might focus on particular species that you were interested in.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Because just thinking about especially some of those critically endangered species and some of the processes that end up happening that would be detrimental, the benefit of potentially moving them. My other question as well, with my practitioner hat on, is if, and again, this is going to be a big question, so please feel free to be like, I don't know if I can answer that. But say you've come into a property where you don't know the history, you just know that there's a grassland there. It has a lot of those cedars that you were showing us there now. So it does have some quality. As a land care group or as a private property owner, what would be the first thing you would do to try and figure out what species need to be there, and then potentially regaining those back into the landscape?
Good. I mean, really good question. I think, and I would like to challenge people on this. We can look back a lot, so we should also be looking forward. It should be as much about, well, what are the values of that site? Is that of its own right, really valuable? Before you even think about, what's wrong with it and what should we put back into it. So I think one of the things we often think about is what's missing. We're always thinking about how bad is my site, as it were, relative to a really nice site. You'd look for cues, roadsides, places that haven't been grazed. For grassy ecosystems, this means places that haven't been grazed super heavily. That doesn't mean you won't find grassy ecosystem plants on grazed properties. You will. So cemeteries, roadsides, that's where you can look. But the hierarchy is if it's been grazed, you've probably lost all your daisies. And the reason being because they're pretty preferentially grazed. Depending on the amount of disturbance or it's really complicated, because then has this site been supered in the past? You've got elevated phosphorus levels. And so there's a few things going on. So there'll be some indicator species. So there's some actually nice research around that kind of almost starts from, here's what you have in a great site, here's what you'll have left after grazing, here's what you'll have left after you've added super. So there are kind of some cues out there. So you need to be able to, I guess, read the types of plants that you're there. And if I could just take a second, that's why the scraping is thought about. It's like this site has elevated nutrients. We're not going to be able to grow these things here. Well, they'll probably grow, but they'll just get outcompeted. We need to reduce both the weed seed load and the nutrients. So that's where the scalping idea originated from, because of the understanding that history means it's just going to be incredibly hard. So without knowing history, I guess you got to look for the cues for the history.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Because there's so many things that go into every site, and the microsites like you were talking about, and things like mycorrhizal fungi potentially that we don't even know about. So thank you for giving us a lot of food for thought. Everyone is thanking you. And it doesn't look like I'll give another minute or so if anyone has a question that I can. Oh, okay, got one. Thank you. Is it better to regenerate an area with locally collected seeds rather than seed from further away? Should we be thinking about maintaining local genetics rather than introducing new genetics? And are there reasons why or why not to prioritise hyperlocal seed where possible?
Wow, that's
the age-old question.
That's a really big question, probably hard to unpack in a minute or two, because there's going to be some it depends answers. So if you're collecting locally from really tiny populations, so they're likely to have lost genetic diversity through just the number of individuals have lost, that's actually a really bad idea, because what you really do is consigning your plantings to a limited gene pool, which is going to be probably inbreeding. So in that instance, it is actually quite useful to bring in the same species from further afar. So getting back to my button wrinklewort again, we're actually doing that. It's called genetic rescue. We're rescuing low diversity populations by bringing in genes from outside. Crop people have known this for a long time. That leads to a bounce in performance. It's called hybrid vigor. So if you're growing corn and you've got an inbred corn line, the way you get around that is you bring a different corn in, and you breed them and you get hybrid vigor. So that's one consideration. The only other one I'd say is, where will our ecosystems be in 100 years? We can't even work on that scale, but I've been working in these systems for over 30, so it's not that far away. 50 to 100 years, if it's going to be warmer and drier, will your local provenance be able to cope with that? Meaning, will they be able to adapt fast enough to deal with that? So you might think about, well, introducing genes from a drier part of that species range, doesn't have to be that far away, but a drier part of that range might introduce genes that are more about drought tolerance. And that might be super important. And so that's happening in some instances, and we're seeing benefits of that. I guess what I'm going to say in the grassy ecosystem space is I want to save species first and foremost. Local provenances actually are the thing that contribute to the saving of species, all of those diversities. So if we plant locally and we lose something further down the road, 10 k's down the road, you actually lose that potential opportunity to have a varying genetic base that allows species to evolve. Remembering pre-us, white people coming here and fragmenting and buggering up the landscape, genes were probably moving around the landscape way more freely than they are now. So I think the last answer I'd give there is if your seeds are so maladapted to your site, they're not going to survive anyway. Like they're going to sort themselves out. But what I fear is that your local provenance might become maladapted, and hence you lose it because it's no longer as suitable to that site as it historically was. But that's we could do a whole seminar just on that.
Yes, it's a massive, I'm going to say beton burrow to go down rather than rabbit burrow. But there's a lot of questions, and then introducing things with hybridization and things like that, and testing that vigor. So thank you. And we have one last question about the role of mycorrhizal fungi as well. So most mammals have gone from these habitats, and they may have been key vectors in moving the fungi about. How much do we actually know about those processes?
Well, outside of grassy ecosystems, we know quite, I won't say a lot, we know a fair bit. Grassy ecosystems, we know less, but we know that they are important, and where they kick in are potentially in growth rates and fit, like this, how vigorous a plant is. So if you lose those, and that can happen because of agricultural practices, spraying, phosphorus and all that sort of stuff, ploughing and what have you, and then we try and bring and then we just try and plant plants back in those sites. Sometimes there is evidence that that doesn't work very well because they've lost those. In the scheme of things, grassy ecosystems are at the lower end of the mycorrhizal needs. Like they are actually at the lower end. That doesn't mean that they're not important. Many of the annuals, and this is the kicker, many of the annuals actually need mycorrhizae because they germinate and they go to flowering straight away. So where do they get their nutrients and water from, particularly where do they get the nutrients from? It's mycorrhizae, actually. And so the loss of annuals from our grassy ecosystems might in part be tied up with the loss of mycorrhizae. That's a huge speculative hypothesis. But some work I've done shows that they're colonised by mycorrhizae really quickly. And so you can't have annuals, pretty much, where you don't have these mycorrhizae, is what I think the outcome is where I'm going with that.
Oh, that's amazing. There's just so many things to think about. So I'd like to again say thank you, John, for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. There's a lot there that we're all going to go home and talk about and think about and apply to our projects and our seed production areas. And just thank you again for being a part of our Seeds of Knowledge series. The whole point is to get this knowledge out there to everyone so that people can apply this to their projects. And thank you everyone for coming along tonight as well. Thank you everyone. Have a great night. And,
thanks everyone.
Hopefully we will see you all again sometime soon.